Hey, it's Alex. Welcome to Papertrail. I've got something a little different for you this month. My guest is the YouTuber and physicist Simon Clarke, and the books he's chosen have affected not just his outlook on life, but also how he approaches and promotes science. Simon picked some great books, one of which is a favourite of mine, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. That's enough from me. Here I am, speaking with Simon Clarke. Simon Clarke, welcome to Papertrail.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm a big fan of your channel, so
thank you.
So exciting to have someone. I think it'll be interesting to have someone other than a sort of published author on as well. It's always good to see how other creative people are interacting with books.
I mean, you say that. I did have a short story published in an online anthology once, so I'm technically a published author,
there we go.
But not a famous one.
Still on track. still on track. That's fine.
I would like to write in the future because I'm a big book fan. I love writing, so it's one of my sort of impossible list things to do to write a popular science book and maybe a fiction book. I don't know. I've got so many ideas that I could be following, but I just never have the time to pursue them because I end up doing stupid things like my degree and video making.
Just that small thing, that PhD. Nothing major.
It just gets in the way so much.
Oh, it's a problem. Well, Well, thank you for coming on. I'm very excited to talk about all the books that you've chosen. In particular, the first book you've chosen, which is a personal favourite of mine, which is My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. So just to give people an insight into the book, it's an autobiographical account of Gerald Durrell and his 4 years. Is it 4 years or 5 years that he spent on the island of Corfu?
Ooh, I think it's 4. It's, as I should point out, it has been a little while. I reread it not that long ago, but most of my recollection comes from when I first read it when I was 7. So
wow, you read it very young.
Yeah, we went on holiday to Jersey, which is where Gerald Durrell later in his life set up Jersey Zoo, which became known as Durrell later. My parents gave it to me then. I think they basically said, I think you're old enough for this now. It was just brilliant. It made a huge impact on my life. It's one of those moments that you always remember when someone introduces you to something. Like when you find out about Firefly or Star Wars for the first time. It's that light bulb moment.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you were in Jersey when you read it. I try when I'm on holiday anywhere, I try and take a book from wherever I'm visiting, or at least from the country where I'm visiting, to try and I always find that adds a certain flavour to the reading. So it's interesting that when you first read it, you were not in Corfu, but you were in a place which is sort of a big part of Gerald Durrell's legacy.
Yeah, because I've never been to Corfu, but as I understand it, based on my extensive knowledge of sun-sex and suspicious parents, it's been somewhat turned into a holiday, like a partying hotspot. So I don't think it's quite the same anymore, which is a shame. Whereas Jersey is basically eternal. It never seems to change that much. And certainly the zoo that he established has remained it's been very conservative and stayed with the ideas that he gave it. And it hasn't had much mission drift at all, which is really great to see.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. I mean, what you say about Corfu is I think that's what I've heard as well. For a long time when I was a kid, after I read it, I was like, I need to go to Corfu. And then you realise that it has sort of become this party island, and it's a bit of a shame. But at least you still get to experience it through My Family and Other Animals, which I think, whenever I'm asked to describe it, what's it like, I'm just like, it is a text that is full of wonder. That's what the thing I always get when I read most of Durrell's stuff, because I'm a big Gerald Durrell fan.
Same, yeah.
But when I read that in particular, I think he's so good at bringing a sense of wonder for what he's discovering, and it's childlike wonder, but it's also, as he gets older, that wonder doesn't disappear.
He never grew up in that sense. I think, and because I'm pretty sure I've read almost everything he's ever published. Because he wrote several books about his childhood. My Family and Other Animals is the first and the most famous of them. He also wrote a series of books about his travels collecting animals for other zoos, because that was his job. He went off to places like, at the time there were British colonies, British Guinea and Cameroon, stuff like that, and collected these animals, and these amazing stories about how he was chasing an anteater on horseback on the pampas, stuff like that, and then he wrote a series of books about that, and he wrote a series of books about the zoo that he'd established, and in a way they were almost like essays about how to run a zoo, and you still found them interesting because he maintained that sense of childish wonder. he just never lost that spark in his eye about meeting a species for the first time. Even when he was in his, I think, 70s. I can't remember how old he was when he died, but either in his 70s or 80s, when he met an eye for the first time, he was entranced by this creature, and it was like the 10 or 8-year-old boy, or however old he is in My Family and Other Animals, just all over again. And he's I think the amazing thing about his books is that he captures. He externalizes that internal, obviously very intense feeling he has in a way that's accessible. And he does that in a way that doesn't anthropomorphize the animals. Because I think people, a criticism they sometimes have is he makes them like people. But I think, yes, he makes them like people in that he attributes personality traits to them, makes you aware of what the animal is like without you having never met a coatimundi or wherever it may be. But he doesn't anthropomorphize it and make it cute and make it and impose human stuff onto it. He uses the human stuff as an analogy, which I find just fantastic. He just brings them to life, really, really does. And and in the case of My Family and Other Animals, it's a snapshot of what Corfu was like in the 1930s, which obviously we're never going to capture again. But it is so vibrant. The language that he uses is so fantastic that it is just like the islands come back to life in your hands when you're reading it.
It is still a scientific text as well. That's what I think is so good about it. Like, I think I read somewhere that said that Durrell never particularly actually liked writing. He always saw it as a way of communicating the importance of conservation.
Yes, and raising money for conservation. It was really an important revenue stream rather than a personal desire he had to write.
Exactly, and I think that is almost because the writing is artful, but he's trying to be informative. It just happens that he's got so much enthusiasm that it just comes out. It doesn't feel contrived the way that he's describing animals. It's how he approaches animals. He will find them, he'll look at their personality traits, and he'll better understand them.
It's very genuine, yeah. And I think that's the reason they're so successful. He went on to write so many is because he was so genuine in his description of the animals, and why he went on to be such a passionate force for conservation, because he believed in what he was talking about, which unfortunately is quite rare in the 20th century.
As well, I think he had a genuine affection for animals, but I think he had a genuine affection for people as well, because something that really brings My Family and Other Animals, Birds, Beasts and Relatives as well, or any of his books, but in those two books in particular, I think the people that he talks about, in particular his family, who are
wonderful,
fantastic characters. I love them so much. Everyone, all the way through from his mother right down to Margot, who I think gets a bit of a short stick to a degree.
I think he wrote that from the perspective of a young boy who just inherently finds teenage girls just these mysterious creatures.
Tiresome.
Yes.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly how I feel about it. It's sort of like he's got his mother, who is just this patient goddess who I love. There's a beautiful actual dedication to her at the start of my copy of My Family and Other Animals, where you can feel his love for her come through the book there as well. But you can feel his enthusiasm, like his just love and affection for his entire family and for the people that he meets, for Theostephanidis, the Ladybug Man.
The man with the insects on strings.
Yes, the man with the
He's the one that stuck with me the most, funnily. Or him and Spiro, actually.
Yeah, Spiro, with his tale about the scorpion in the ear, the man who fell asleep.
Also because I just picture him as John Rhys Davies from the Indiana Jones films. Is it Salah? That's the guy's name. And it's just that guy. And you make that connection. It's like a link being forged that it's permanent. You can't unsee that connection.
He's such a good watcher of living things. I think that's what makes him so good at the kind of writing that he do. Like, he observes people and places so well and just lets it. There's no writer's filter in what he's writing. Like, it's genuinely, that is how he sees the world, and he's putting it down on paper. That's what I think has always made Durrell stand out to me as a writer.
And the other thing I think that stands him out is he's a genuinely very funny author. I mean, him and Douglas Adams, I think, are the two funniest authors I've ever read.
And both conservationists.
Yes, funnily enough. Humour in the way he describes stuff, but also finding humour in the situation. So recently, I have it in my bag. I think it's 3 Singles to Adventure, I think it was called, which is about one of his animal collecting trips, and finding the humour in situations such as him and some friends who had to strip and swim across a lake to find a particular species and then realised it was full of piranhas. And they had these 3 English gentlemen who are completely, completely butt naked, and the whitest things you can imagine. And they were totally naked apart from hats. They all kept their sort of trilby or whatever it was hats they were wearing. So they just very quickly backpedaled and started breaststroking back across the lake. And the way he describes that, it could be a situation that, another author, say, I don't know, your Stephen King's or someone like that, would have described it as a terrifying situation. But he was just looking at the humor of the situation, which I love. He's just the most. It's charming. If I had to use one word to describe his prose, it's absolutely charming.
Yeah, no, I would agree. If I ever meet someone who hasn't read it, I'm like, you should read it. And if I meet someone who has, it's like I found a gem and I'm become a bore for 40 minutes while I do exactly what we're doing right now. But I just a question: who is your favorite family member? Do you have a favorite family member?
Oh, I mean, if I'm allowed to pick Jerry, I choose him.
Yeah, sure.
Because for one thing, when I was that age, I was very interested in bugs and the natural world and things like that. So I empathized very deeply with him. I think apart from him, I'd have to go with Mother.
Yeah.
Because she is just, as you said, this just domestic saint. There's the most patient woman who's ever lived, who tolerates
this wild family.
Tolerated the wild family and effectively a zoo living in the houses that they move from very frequently. And even in later books, he uses her garage, I think, to keep monkeys in. And things like that.
Yeah, I think that's in his dedication. He says he came home one day to his mother's house and she was chasing a pelican round her garden, and she was like, "Oh, thank God you're here." And he's like, "How did you know it was from me?" She's like, "Well, who else is going to send me a pelican, darling?" I think Mother is the obvious choice, but I do have a soft spot for Leslie just because of how ridiculous this sort of alpha male, sort of like British Hemingway.
Yes,
that's how I sort of
all
imagine
the guns.
Yeah, all the guns. Like one of my favourite scenes from My Family and Other Animals is where Lawrence, his oldest brother, who's a writer and a nuisance, opens what he thinks is a box of matches, but it's actually filled with scorpions.
Yes, I forgot about that.
and they're all screaming, and Leslie appears wearing nothing but his shotgun, like just sort of like absolutely nude in the middle of this kitchen where everyone is screaming, trying to find something to point his shotgun at. That scene has always stuck with me. But yeah, it's just such a romp. It's a romp of a book, but it is such, I think, an important book for children to read because it does show, it gives people an insight into the wonders of nature in a way that is better than a zoo trip, you could say. Like but it feels just as involving, like you get pulled into this book and you're filled with such, I don't know,
it's a perfect book to lose yourself in.
And it's contagious, his enthusiasm.
Definitely. And it's a wonderful travel book, I found.
Yes.
I think both the times I've read it, I think I've been traveling somewhere or another, on Jersey or on a plane or something. And it isn't the most meaningful text in the world. It's not got a huge amount to say about the human condition necessarily, but it's charming and it's light, and I love it. I think if I had to pick one book that was my favorite that I've ever read, I think I'd have to go for My Family and Other Animals.
Yeah, it's the one if you were abandoned on an island with one book, it's my book as well.
I mean, I also, because I've been lucky enough to do some video filming at Durrell.
Yes.
And I met Gerald's widow, which was a really bizarre experience because I wasn't expecting it at all. And that's the other thing about the book is that it's given me this very, very deep connection to conservation and animal rights issues, but more generally species conservation in the wild and supporting the work that Durrell does as a charity. And in a way, I think I'll always be grateful to the book for that, for opening my eyes and giving me that passion.
That was actually something I was going to ask you about that later on. But yeah, I wanted to ask, what's it like being able to work in this environment, which is so, it is a Durrell legacy, like being able to engage with it. I'm always interested when people encounter something, because reading a book is a very intimate thing. Like, and you can start to, especially autobiographical non-fiction work, you can start to feel very close to a person. So I do wonder what it's like for you to now sort of be working with them and being even closer to his work.
I mean, filming on the site at Jersey Zoo it was like heaven. It was. I got there first thing in the morning, and then I wouldn't leave until sort of like when the zoo was closing at 6 or 7, and you go home absolutely exhausted, but you weren't aware that you were exhausted until you got home because you were just so you're entranced with where you were, and you were so conscious of how lucky you were to be there, but you also felt the pressure of doing right by that inspiration. I was there because of Gerald Durrell's books, and I felt that I had I was honor bound to do the best job that I possibly could. So it was a very strange mix of being elated, just some of the happiest days of my life, being, going in and actually going into the enclosure with tamarins and having them climb over me, and filming some of the world's rarest snakes, and getting behind the scenes access to all this kind of stuff. It was just wonderful, and this sort of pressure that I was putting on myself. They were very kind and welcoming, and they were so relaxed about it. But I put on myself to do the best job that I possibly could to justify, to sort of try and pay Gerald back, I guess.
Well, I saw some of those videos. I thought they were fantastic. So very well done. It's very clear we both love this book. But if the last 10 minutes haven't made that very clear. But I would like to focus in terms of sort of drawing a thread between this book and some of the other ones you've chosen. Going back to what I said about Durrell, what's so interesting about him is he seems to marry the enthusiasm and semi-romantic idea of nature with the analytical and the scientific point of view. And I think that's interesting that you enjoyed that. And then the next book that you've picked, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that sort of balance of the two is very much at the heart of the philosophy that Robert Pirsig is trying to access there.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, actually. I mean, the reason that I picked Zen was because I read it at a key point in my development as a person, I think. I read it just before I left for university. I was about 17. And it basically formed what I now consider to be basically the philosophy by which I live my life, which I suppose is interesting to make the point about that mix of the wonder of nature and the scientific nature of it. And there's a sort of an equilibrium point between the two of them, where I find myself being half very rational and then half humanities based and qualitative. It's the mix between qualitative and quantitative perspectives on the world, which I found so interesting about it, and it was obviously very persuasive, and I was engaged with it because I base a lot of what I do now on the ultimate message that he conveys about the idea of quality. So it was interesting. So I haven't really read a philosophical text since I finished my A-levels, so it was interesting to come back. I don't know what I was expecting with this book, but I don't think I was not expecting what I got from it. But I thought the most interesting part for me was, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that early on it is revealed that Robert Pirsig had electroshock therapy. The way that he accesses the philosophy through that is quite interesting. The fact that he is essentially assessing his own thought process, but with kind of a new mind. The whole premise of it is interesting, I think, because it's semi-autobiographical. I suppose that's another link to My Family and the Other Animals, in that it's as I understand it, it's detailing the emotional journey that he went on with his therapy and dealing with multiple personalities. But not the details of his life necessarily. I mean, the key plot of I suppose it's the plot, it's the structure of the book, is him taking a motorcycle trip with his son and talking about these ideas. I'm never entirely sure how you pronounce it. Chautauqua? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Chautauqua or Chautauqua? I'm not sure, but it's something it's a traveling. Basically, Chautauqua was a series of lectures that you would take on the road around America, as I understood it, and it feels like he's sort of delivering them to himself as he rides around, and also to his son. I mean, is the other thing. I mean, it does also, and this is another link to the last book, which we'll talk about. It does slightly reek of "Look how clever I am," which I'm never a very big fan of. And that's certainly one aspect that, on looking back at it again, when I was a kid, I didn't mind it. I was thinking, "Oh, this is really clever." And now I read it as an adult and think, "Oh, goodness sakes! Like, stop trying to impress us with how clever you are." Like the author described himself as a mild-mannered hyper-intellectual, which sort of tells you a lot about the author, I suppose. But journey that the character takes and the lessons that he communicates with that, and it's communicated I suppose primarily in terms of page length, it's communicated by the motorcycle trip, but it's also told in flashback. Flashback to his electroshock therapy and flashback to earlier in his life where he's developing a lot of these ideas. I see there's a particular scene that really stuck with me about him being in the hull of a ship. I think it was when he was on military service. Is that right? He was coming back from somewhere in Asia.
He was on military service. He went to Korea.
That was it. Yes. And he was coming back to America, eating these big green Washington apples in the hull of the ship, and just thinking. And for some reason, that really stuck with me as this image of him coming to these insights about the nature. Because the subtitle to the book is. An inquiry into the value of quality, I think.
Yes, yeah, and that's what he is obsessed with, the idea of what quality is and whether quality can be achieved.
Yes, so because it is a quantity which is very difficult to pin down, to actually describe, and the book is the only case that I've seen which is given a definition that I'm satisfied with.
And I mean, what's interesting is I suppose right at the end, he lands on a definition of quality that he's relatively happy with. But even then, he's like, it's not perfect. But he does also sort of land on. It felt like I've only recently finished it. I probably still need to process it a bit more. But it does feel like he landed on the realization that sort of people had already agreed what quality was. They were just using a different term for it, and eventually it became Plato's good, the good.
Yes. But interestingly, the definition for quality that he comes to is based on, the interpretation that I get from it at least is based on quality of the hero in the Odyssey. And he's quoting another author called Kitto, which I can't seem to find any more information about, which is a bit annoying. But the point that he makes is that equality is not efficiency in doing things; it is efficiency in life itself. Not efficiency in the department of life, that's it. And not in one department of life, but in life itself. Which is a quote that's just sort of resonated with me as soon as I read it. And that's kind of what I mean when I say that it sort of guides a lot of what I do, and that it determines, me thinking about how I can be a better person. It's learning how to approach new problems and not necessarily getting good at doing a particular thing, but getting better at approaching new things for the first time, and being efficient in life rather than efficient in tasks in life, I suppose.
Yeah. There's a nice piece when they've gotten off the bike and they're hiking up the hills. He's hiking up a mountain with his son. It takes them 2 days, and he compares the way that the two of them are trying to climb the mountain, which is he's trying to climb the mountain step by step with no thought about I think he calls it ego climbing versus, I can't remember what he calls his version of climbing, but his son is climbing for his ego. His son is climbing to get to the top, and all that matters to him is the outcome, whereas he is sort of like trying to, every bit of light, all the dappled light that comes through it, he's enjoying it as he goes, and it's about being current, I suppose. I think that's a big, like being current in your research as well, being current in your thinking as well.
I suppose there's a link to mindfulness there, really. This moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness, to quote John Kabat-Zinn, which is kind of what is implicit in what he's talking about there. But I think this predates the mindfulness movement. I think this was the early 70s that he wrote this, so it's a little bit earlier. But presumably this influenced a lot of other stuff that I've read since. It was.
I certainly, like, as I was reading, I was like, this is mindfulness. Like this, or this sounds a lot like mindfulness. Like what mindfulness will become as I was going through it. But I did find that very interesting. I think for me, I was always looking at it from I couldn't get away from the narrative, like that reveal that he'd had this, that he had been, that Phaedrus, he refers to sort of the past version of himself as Phaedrus, who's a character from Plato. The sort of idea that he had been one person and then he'd had treatment and he was now another person, or another personality, or had been told that he was another personality.
And then the original personality is sort of...
They're converging. Yeah, he talks a lot about geometry and the idea that two lines will eventually meet. which isn't geometry, but he was talking about how two lines would eventually meet.
Well, it is in a non-Riemannian sense.
Yes, yeah,
or non-Euclidean geometry.
Yeah, it's 3 kinds of geometry. That was where I started to be like, I'm lost now. But yeah, that narrative was, I think, what gripped me. Like, the philosophy was interesting, and I was like, this is cool. But I think a big part of what gripped me for the book was the father-son relationship and the journey itself, which I think there's a struggling father-son relationship there as well, because
yes, well, his son has difficulties, doesn't he? Is it learning difficulties?
Yeah, well, all he says early on is that there's a suggestion that his son has some kind of mental illness, is how he describes it. But it's also about the idea that his son knew one version of him, and now his son knows another version of him, and trying to reconcile those two people. Yeah. Which I found that was perhaps the most gripping part of the book for me. That was the part which was very interesting. It was also very frustrating. You know, I thought that sometimes he was quite harsh to his son.
Yes, I thought that as well. Yeah, it's not it is a loving relationship, but not all the time. He feels a lot of frustration towards the way that his son looks at the world, and by extension to the other 2 people that accompany him at the start of the journey.
Yeah, I did not feel his love for his initial travel partners. He was not very impressed with them at all. But I did think that was very interesting. I think that was what propelled me through the book. I think because, as you say, there's an element sometimes of, look how clever I am, and maybe if it wasn't hanging on that sort of interesting narrative thread, I'm not sure that I would have made it through to the end.
Yes, yeah, I'd agree with that. It gives you a human connection to what would otherwise be a very dry philosophical kind of text that allows. And you know, this was hugely popular when it first came out. I know my parents described it to me as, it was like, oh, that was the Matrix of our generation, I think is how they described it. And yeah, I think it's because in both cases there's a huge amount of philosophy and metaphysics in this case associated with it, but it's accessible because those unfurl from the key plot points as you go along, and the 2 plots, I suppose, because you've got the present and the past. So it makes it satisfying both as a piece of narrative, as a piece of fiction, and also as a philosophical text.
I don't know whether you read. My version that I read has an afterthought from him about 10 years after the book had come out. I don't know if you've read that.
Yeah, I think I might have done, actually.
Basically, so it turns out. I don't know if I should say this. Do you know what I'm going to say? What happened to his son later on in life? But that added an extra layer to the whole book for me.
So the son died afterwards.
Yes.
In was it
someone tried to mug him and he was stabbed.
Yes,
in San Francisco.
That was it. Yes.
Which I thought was incredibly sad. And
and that adds certainly a bittersweet kind of. Bittersweet because of his relationship with his son. That's not fantastic at points during the book, and also that sense of his son never got to go on the same philosophical journey as we as the reader did, because Pirsig is telling us all about his thought processes, and there's kind of the expectation that his son will eventually pick up on it and go along the same path that we as the reader did, but knowing that he doesn't it makes me quite sad, in the same way that the people who don't read the book will ever go through that that's philosophical journey. Yeah,
and it's heartbreaking as well, I think, because the other details of before the stabbing, he was just leaving the San Francisco Zen and Buddhism school, and he just booked a flight to London, so that you almost get this taste that he was almost there. He was about to take his own journey, and then it was just sort of cut short. But yeah, it was a very bittersweet ending to the book. But I think it would have been interesting almost to have taken some time to have finished the book without that afterthought, and then to read the afterthought later as well. A really interesting book. And I think it's interesting that he actually mentions in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance your 3rd book, A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's only a brief mention, but I locked onto it because I knew I was going to be reading that as well. But
when does he mention that? Because that totally passed me by. I don't remember that.
When he's talking about quality, it's a very brief mention, but the idea of how a search for quality and perfection can lead people awry, I think is his mention to it. It was.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it is a very in passing kind of thing.
Yes, he doesn't go into it in detail, but I was just like, oh, that's interesting. It's obviously in his thoughts as well. But yeah, Brave New World. I was excited to read this because it's one of those, like, you hear a load about 1984 to the point that you basically know 1984 without having read it. So when I got a chance to read A Brave New World, or was given the opportunity, I was like, oh, well, this will be interesting, because it's one of those books that a lot of people say, you know, it's similar to 1984. It's not dystopia, it's a utopia, but it's sort of a parody of a utopia or a negative utopia.
I'd argue it is still a dystopia. I think it's a much more compelling dystopia than 1984 ever is. I always found 1984 to be not all that convincing. And I think maybe we're the wrong generation. I think maybe 1984 became so popular because of the Cold War and this very paranoid state that everybody was living in of mass surveillance, which admittedly is still happening today, but also these serpentine intelligence agencies that work in the shadows, like the KGB and the CIA. And I feel like we don't have that so much now, or maybe they've got so good at their jobs that we don't really notice it. Whereas I think Brave New World is a lot more compelling because it's a dystopia that's not bound by surveillance and by fear, but by the hedonistic desires that come internally and are facilitated by the state, which I think is much closer to where we are today.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. But I would say it's certainly. I certainly don't think I would describe it as utopian. I mean, it wasn't. It was meant to be a mocker. Like, he was making fun of. I think it was H.G. Wells's utopias. It was kind of meant to be this negative utopia. Like, look, I'm going to build a perfect world as well, and sort of lead some mockery to it. But I thought it was a very interesting book, and I sort of struggled with it as I was reading it the first time, because I was sort of like, does he like this world, or does he not like this world? Like, it's sort of, does he think this is a good idea, or does he not? And it seems like Huxley had a similar struggle with it himself when he initially wrote it, and then when it finally did get published. So what sort of period of your life were you in when you first met with A Brave New World?
I read this way too young. I read this when I was about 10 or 11, I think. And considering the content of the book, I think this was a parental recommendation. I think my mum basically said, maybe this would be interesting for you to read. And I think because I read it so early, it really impacted on my thinking a lot. But I didn't really appreciate a lot of what was going on in the book. In the same way that actually I read, for example, Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials. Mm-hmm. I'm glad I read them when I was young, but rereading them at a later age gave a lot more depth to what I got from it. But I read it when I was about 10 or 11. And the reason I picked it, and the reason it's made such a difference to me, is because it was the first book, or the first thing, I suppose, that taught me that just because something is logical doesn't make it right, and the difference between different people's value judgments. Because on the surface, this world, and this taps into why you called it a utopia, is perfect. There's no war. Everyone is living these perfectly happy lives. Everyone's perfectly, it's gorgeous and gets everything they want up until they turn 60 or 70, and then they're gone. They don't have an old age.
They're immolated.
They are immolated. But yeah, it taught me that that is. You look at this world objectively and think, "Oh wow, this is fantastic," and then you think, "This is awful." Like, there's this world is hellish. There's no long-term relationships. People who have long-term relationships are thought of being strange. There's no children being born. They are indoctrinated from a young age with these platitudes and propaganda from the government, which again, this might already sound like our present world. That's definitely one aspect that I feel like it's a bit umbraging, the way that the education system in this country is going. There's that. There's the fact that, you could argue that religion has been outlawed and it's been replaced by, what's his first name? Henry Ford's, manufacturing ideas. Yeah, manufacturing line of humans that makes all humans perfectly happy, but slaves to of course, and the other I almost completely forgot the social caste system where people are born into I think it goes from epsilon up to alpha plus.
Yes,
and you are born into this caste, and that is where you will live the rest of your life. There is no social mobility, which I'm sure is informed by his experiences with Britain at the start of the 20th century, and arguably still now. It's a horrifying world. That it makes perfect sense, and I think that was why I found it so compelling.
Yeah, it's a very logically created world, and it's sort of like, okay, well, this is how it's worked. You would indoctrinate them from very young. When they would sleep, you would pump these dogmatic laws into their heads and make them, they'd be perfectly and everyone will be perfectly happy. And I think it's quite interesting because when I was first reading it, for that first third of the book, maybe you are quite uncomfortable because it doesn't quite seem to fit. And then with the introduction of John, who sort of becomes, in the second half of the book, the protagonist, they introduce this supposed savage, John, who's living on a savage enclosure, which is basically a place which has a lot of core fundamental beliefs like we have right now. And he's the eyes through which we're actually able to view the world and be like, okay, this is wrong. Like, I think that was what was interesting. Like, when you're first reading it, it is like, oh, this is quite, I mean, obviously this is weird, but it's interesting that he's put this all together. And then you get given this other pair of eyes which can disassemble it. Or basically, I think it's Huxley being able to speak and disassemble it through him and pull it down. The way this utopia is set up is it discourages critical thinking, personal initiative, and also natural reproduction. Right, like the idea of emotional connections is discouraged in this.
And that's something that maybe it's because I don't know. I'm quite. It's certainly compared to my university friends, I'm not in the mainstream of how people do things. I mean, I would argue that things, for example, like Grindr and Tinder and apps like that are actually, you're starting to see this resurgence of people who just, it's a move away from traditional values of long-term relationships and marriage and all that kind of stuff, and people who just want to go through many sexual partners one after the other. Basically focused on hedonistic individual pleasures rather than shared couple stuff. Now, that's not a fair assessment of everybody who uses those apps, I should point out. But I feel like the world is tending towards the vision that we see in this. I mean, when Huxley wrote in, there's the scene where they go to the Feelies.
Yes,
and it's like a film, but they can feel the sensations. I think that was written in, as I understand it, because film had just become a thing at the time of writing, and he viewed this as the start of a slippery slope away from, I suppose, what he considered to be godly or good pastimes like reading books or going to see plays, and removing yourself from a shared experience and putting yourself into an individual kind of experience that only you feel. I'd be very interested to see what Huxley made of the modern state of the entertainment industry and the fact that movies are everywhere, television's everywhere. Internet pornography is a huge thing. I'd be very interested to see how that would have fitted into his vision of the future, whether he'd just turn up in 2016 and go, yep, I told you guys, this is exactly what I warned you would happen. The only thing that's missing is the mass distribution of Soma, this drug that keeps everyone in line.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it was. I don't know how I feel about the book. Like, it's one of those weird ones where I keep thinking about it. I'm like, I don't know how I feel.
It definitely has the same case of I'm very smart-itis. It is a very arrogant book for him to write, and I'm rereading it at a later age. I think I've read it 3 times now. Actually, you do get this sense of, oh goodness sakes, like the use of language here is just not justified by the outcome that you've got with it. The ideas, I don't have a problem with the ideas that he's putting forward in the book, but the way in which he tells it is very much like, look at me, look how... presumably, Huxley had a group of very clever friends that he was trying to impress, who were also authors and presumably all on various psychoactive substances, as they all were at the time. I have reservations about the book, and I think the more I read it, the further I stray from my initial kind of awe of how good it was. But it still, for me, has, again, similar to Zen and the Art, it has this sort of had this philosophical effect on me, of considering that you don't have to do everything in a perfectly logical way. You have to consider what you think is right at the same time.
There are these immaterial elements that
and it's the tug away from the quantitative in the same way that I suppose My Family and Other Animals pulls me to being as a scientist and to describing the world in a quantitative way. Zen and Brave New World pull me to the other end of the spectrum and to be more of a touchy-feely kind of way of looking at the world. That's
something that I wanted to talk. All 3 of these books, I think you could argue they are to a degree about the scientific method, about the approach, like approaching something creativity and poetically as well as mechanically and scientifically, and about how the importance of that balance. Like you could argue that for us, at least, Gerald Durrell is an example of what happens when you perfectly marry, or not perfectly, but very well marry the two, and the sort of positive impact that can have on people. And then A Brave New World is an example of what goes wrong if you stick too close to one of the two extremes.
Yes,
and then Zen is an example of someone basically deliberating that. So in that sense, it was almost quite a nice little mini curriculum for me to go through, I suppose, when I was reading all three of them.
Yeah, it's not something that I considered actually until sort of in getting ready for this podcast. I had thinking about it a little bit more detail, and you're right. There's definitely a connecting thread between the lot of them in terms of outlook on the world. And I think, you're right. It is specifically looking at a scientific kind of. Through what lens do you view the world? Do you view? There's a Richard Feynman quote about looking at flowers and whether you see the cellular or biological description of what the flower is, or you have the humanities description of how the flower makes you feel, what it looks like. And the point that he makes is that actually, truly, you should have both. And I think that's what the books have taught me, is that it is very possible to view them as both, and they're not mutually exclusive. And they actually complement each other. They actually, one informs your appreciation of the other. So you can see the aesthetic and touchy-feely kind of beauty in the biological makeup of a flower, just as the how miraculous it is that it reaches that exact configuration that maths and evolutionary biology can tell you appreciates the aesthetics of it.
Yeah, it's like in Zen, he talks about how the Godhead is in the engine. Like that you can still, there's something spiritual in the mechanical object, and that he's trying to marry those two. I think it's an interesting thread, and one that I found interesting because obviously you are a scientist, but you are a scientist who's approaching your field in sort of a non-traditional way, doing a lot of work with YouTube and with film. So I thought it was quite interesting to see that the three books that you picked sort of make that argument, you could say.
Yeah, it's not something that I've consciously thought about, but I think they were definitely very key in forming who I am as a person, and as a scientist in particular, maybe. Yeah.
Well, hopefully some other people will read them. This mini syllabus that we've created.
Please do. Okay, that's the other thing I should stress, is that they're all fantastic books, and if we haven't encouraged you to read them enough, please do, because you're missing out if you haven't tried them. Especially My Family and Other Animals. Yeah, if I had to pick one, that one.
Yeah, really. It's got to be. Well, brilliant. Well, Simon, this has been great. Thank you for coming on the show. And
thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, and best of luck with the channel. I'm watching it. I'm really enjoying the stuff that you're putting out.
Well, thank you. I'll make sure that this gets a shout out in the next vlog when it comes out.
Oh, thank you very much. Cheers, Simon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Papertrail. Thanks to Simon for his book choices, and thank you to Scott Grattan for our music. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on iTunes. It makes it a lot easier for other people to find and enjoy these conversations as well. You can also find us on Twitter at PapertrailPod, or visit the website at www.papertrailpodcast.com. I'll be back next month with another interview. Until then, thanks for your time.